Hi everyone and welcome back. We are joined by Cyrus Janssen, an expert on China and also China's economic development. So thanks for coming back on.
Glenn, my pleasure. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
So I wanted to ask you about China's growing presence in Africa, which is either it's demonized or it's celebrated. It's often either way huge attention around this, but often focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative. However, last month we saw that 53 African nations signed this 100% tariff-free deal with the Chinese. What do you make of this, new developments?
Yeah, Glenn, it's a great question. Well, I think I want to start really at the beginning because I think for so many years we have always heard of China's ambitions in Africa being described as debt trap diplomacy. And actually, it's very interesting because this three words have now really come to represent what many in what mainstream media and certainly Western media always used to describe China. But the fascinating thing is that the Belt and Road Initiative is now 12 years old. And there has never been a single project that has ever been seized by the Chinese government. They've never actually had a country default on their loans and then take that over. So there's this big theory, this basically a fear, given by the media that, look, China has ulterior motives. What they're trying to do is they're basically going to lend out all of these loans to these poor African countries. At some point, they're not going to be able to repay the loans. And then that's when China's going to make their big move. They're going to come in, they're going to take all of this land, all of these government buildings. They're going to basically conquer Africa and colonize it. That's the theory. But again, we haven't seen a single piece of evidence to suggest that. And actually, we've seen the opposite. We've actually seen China actually forgive loans. And so we've seen them actually look at countries and say, you know what, we've given you this loan. You can't pay that back. We're just going to write it off, and we're going to write it off as debt because on the Belt and Road, China has actually signed over 1,100 projects. And when you think about that scale, 1,100 projects throughout the world, think of it like an investment account, right? Not every project's going to be successful, right? Some of them will fail, some of them will succeed, some of them will be average. But with 1,100 projects, you've got quite a lot of opportunity for some success. There has been a lot of projects that have done very well. And I think with the ones that haven't, they're able to write that off and still move forward because over the portfolio, you still have a net increase, much like having a balanced stock portfolio. Okay, great. A couple of stocks went down by a lot of money, but we've had a lot of winners. And so the net return on the portfolio is actually positive. So yeah, this is the first point I really want to address is that we haven't really seen any evidence suggesting that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy. But very often it's like we see in Western media, we portray China in a certain way. And, this is used as a fear tactic to really make sure that people in the Western countries really fear China. I think ultimately it's because, for example, the United States, they don't have the resources to be investing and building an initiative like China. And so I think that's why they have to come up with these campaigns to try to smear China. And unfortunately, it's sad because, what Africa desperately needs more than anything is the roads, the airports, the ports, the infrastructure. That's how you get out of poverty, right? It's not by donating food, that's a common saying, right? Feed a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach the man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So that's how China is really helping out these countries by actually building the infrastructure where they can, in fact, build up a business, get out of debt, and actually have a potentially better future.
And what are the main areas though that China's focusing on? Because often it's seen as simply being maybe it's a bit of projection, but often it's the assumption is that they only want their natural resources, but the economic cooperation goes well beyond resources, even though of course Africa is very resource rich.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's very important to understand with Chinese people and certainly Chinese businessmen is that they're very pragmatic. It's very much like, look, we're be honest. Obviously, China is very interested in the resources from Africa. So is the Western nations, right? Every country is interested in the resources from Africa, but it's the difference is what are you going to provide in exchange for that? So, for example, if you're building schools, hospitals, roads, airports, railways, and tangible benefits to the people of Africa that are going to improve their quality of life, well, that's a very nice exchange, right? We're going to give you something for that. And I think what we have to really look back on, Glenn, is the history of colonization. We look at countries like France and the UK, the United States, that have a very long history of being in Africa, but unfortunately, it has always been a policy of extraction. What can we get from you? And let's be honest, we don't really want to give anything, we want to give you as little for it, and we don't really care about your development. And I think there's a very interesting survey that was published earlier this year, and it was conducted over the span of, I think there was about 1,100 surveys throughout Africa. And it was by a Western think tank, and they said, this is quite amazing because the evidence actually shows that China is genuinely popular amongst many countries in Africa. And so, especially with the youth, they actually broke it down by age demographics. And there was, especially, under the age of 25, very positive, almost over 75, 80% positive response, and how they're looking at China. And again, I mean, if you are under the age of 25, you would have been growing up in a brand new school or a new road. And it's like, hey, guess what? This was built by China. This is who came into the country and built this. And that's why you get to go to school today, because you have a new road there and you have a school there because China built it. And so it's a very interesting, way to build your power and your reputation. And I am all for it. I think it's great. I think it's great for China to do that. And the other thing, Glenn, that's important to understand is that when China builds these projects, they send a tremendous amount of Chinese people that actually live there. So I think when the United States will come to do a project, it's not like people want to move their families there or, establish themselves in African countries. Most Americans are like, no, let's do the deal and get out of there. Let's go back home. Whereas many Chinese actually relocate to Africa. They become part of the community. Their kids become born in Africa. I was in South Africa before, and I was, down in the Chinatown, down in Joburg, and all of the little Chinese kids there are speaking Zulu with the local kids, and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. But of course they would speak that. They're born and raised there, right? They're as local as it gets. But they're speaking Chinese, they're learning English, they're speaking Zulu, and that's the difference in China's approach.
Yeah, I guess the stats are important because whenever you get these media reports, there's always this idea that, well, China wants to take advantage of Africa. We're going to come and help them. But obviously, this is really denying some agency there. But how do you see China's role in Africa, though, evolving? Because what it was 20 years ago is not the same as it was today. And then leading up to where they're today, where they're actually able to sign this agreement with, again, 53 African nations.
Yeah, but I think what we really have to take a step back here, Glenn, is look at just how impressive that is, right? It's 53 of the 54. The one nation that didn't is a very small nation that has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So they formally recognize Taiwan as the government of China, so they're not in on the deal. But the vast majority of I mean, what's 53 out of 54? I mean, it's nearly the entire continent is pledging forward. And there's kind of an interesting thing as well, is when you look at the difference between how China and the United States does their diplomacy, it's actually quite fascinating. Every year, sorry, there is a Africa-China summit, and that actually rotates. So one year it'll be in Beijing, the next year it will be in a country in Africa. So it rotates back and forth. And that's really important because, Xi Jinping will actually personally go and attend this summit in Africa with all of the African leaders. For example, when the United States hosts their summit, it is always held in Washington, D.C. It has never once been held in Africa. And so you can see just how that simple fact alone means quite a lot, because to host it in Africa means you're giving face to them, right? It means this is really a partnership, right? This is a two-way street. And, when you actually look at the U.S.-Africa summit, so much of that content is actually, we think you should be working with the United States. we should not be working with China. And so it's almost like it's a session, it's a 2 to 3 day session of trying to convince African leaders that the United States is better. Whereas China, they're not going to lecture, they're not going to care if you're doing business with the United States. Hey, you do business with whoever you want, but we're having a China-Africa summit, so we're going to talk about how you do business with us. And so, there's almost this jealousy factor. It's a very interesting dynamic to observe where it's very common. A lot of American leaders will come and they will, constantly lecture these African, people that, this is what you need to do. You need to be working with us. And it is quite interesting where there's kind of a saying is when a U.S. leader goes to Africa, they give a lecture. And when China leader goes to Africa, they bring a road, a port, an airport. There's, again, this tangible benefit. And I think that's why you saw 53 nations come together, declare, hey, moving forward in the future, we are going to be putting a lot of our time and effort with China, and we believe that China is going to be a more stable force in the future. And this is a very interesting thing. The Alliance of Democracies, a big think tank, just a couple of weeks ago published this new survey that now shows that 79% of the world now have a higher opinion of China than the United States. So this is actually much more of a global, trend, I would say, is that, yes, Africa is leading that way, but we see this pretty much in the global South, which would be Latin America, South America, all of Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. So this is actually the global majority of people in the world. And this is quite amazing when you start seeing that. And that really should be a wake-up call to the United States politicians, to really understand, look, this is, the world, the perception of the world is changing.
Traditionally, you've had the British and French colonial influence and post-colonial influence, and then, of course, the United States being a more, let's call it a more modern empire. But the entry of China into Africa really disrupts some of the former power structures. To what extent, I know, is this visible, or is this something that the Chinese are struggling with?
I don't think they're struggling, because I think with China, what I really feel is that we know the Chinese are very good at doing business, right? That is what Chinese people do. If you spend time in China, you realize that most Chinese people, they have a very big hunger to do business, to make deals. I mean, at the end of the day, this is the big difference here, is that, for example, China comes in saying, look, we want to do an exchange. You give us A, in return, we'll give you B. We don't need to talk about politics. For example, I don't care what government you run in Africa. There's many different types of governments that exist in Africa. You can have whatever government you want. We're not going to lecture you on that. Again, we're here for A. We give you A, you give us B. Very simple, very pragmatic. And it's a very stark contrast, because in the United States, we have had our senators say, for example, we don't support this African country on gay rights, for example. And if you do not change your policies in your country that appeal to us, we will sanction you, or we will cut off your access to the US dollar, or we will potentially not trade with you. And China says, look, we're not going to get involved. I mean, what you do in your country and the laws that govern your land, that's your country, right? We're not here to tell you that you should convert to a communist government. We're not here to tell you, hey, the policies that your government is passing in your country don't apply to Chinese values. You don't see these contradictions. And so, again, I think you have a very pragmatic approach where, again, China, this is why China is the #1 trading partner for nearly 150 countries around the world, because, again, it's really just about the business. We don't need to get into different ideological battles. I think this is a very clear point from China, that they're very grounded in what China's government is, right? They're very grounded, saying, look, we know what government we want to have in our country, and we will continue to move forward with our plan for our country. But I don't see China going around saying, hey, we should be spreading, Chinese with, socialism with Chinese characteristics. This should be the model for the world. I mean, again, we see the opposite, right? We see the opposite with the United States. The United States is very much, if you're not a democracy, you're an enemy. And we want to change you. We want regime change. We saw even this week, there was a published, probably the most ridiculous report I've ever seen published from a U.S. think tank, saying, preparing for China after the CCP? What's going to happen when Chinese government fails? And it's this 80-page report published by the Hudson Institute out of Washington, D.C., and it's talking about all of these, the China's government's going to fail, democracy is going to come in, here's how American businesses can benefit, this is what America is going to do. And I say, this is a fantasy, right? This is just, I'm sure US politicians might like that to happen, but again, I'm recording this on the ground in Guangzhou, China. Come to China, come to talk to the people, come to see how this country is moving forward. You will see no evidence of this, that this is going to happen. And again, how is the United States interfering in somebody else's country? This is a sovereign country. They get to decide, right? Only the people that decide what government exists here will be China's government and Chinese people. They should have no outside influence at all. And so again, I think, especially for me, Glenn, as a United States citizen, I'm very concerned by this because I see the democracy that is failing in my home country. I see the political problems. I see the instability. And I mean, in my mind, let's focus on our house. I mean, gosh, I don't think there's many countries around the world right now looking at the U.S. president, U.S. democracy, and thinking, that looks great. I think we should study that, political model. But if you do see, for example, China's economic model, that is a blueprint for Africa and for these smaller developing countries, because, this is quite amazing. 50 years ago, the country of Chad in Africa was actually more wealthy than China 50 years ago. So you look at this case study of how China has been able to rise above and become, go from one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world 50 years ago to now, obviously the second biggest economy, number one economy in terms of purchase power parity. And so you look at how China has been able to evolve, and how did they do that? Because of economics, because of opening up, because of manufacturing, because of building the infrastructure, investing. I've traveled extensively on the high-speed rail over the last month in China, all over the country. It's my favorite way to travel. And the train stations are packed. I mean, the ability to get on a high-speed rail and just get to the next city within, an hour is just incredible. I mean, that really does transform how business is done in a country. So I think this is where, and especially in Guangzhou has the largest African population in China. So there's a tremendous amount of Africans that come here. I've had a chance to talk with many of them. It was fascinating when I was coming through the airport customs. There must have been 500 people in line. I would say 80% were from Africa, and all kinds of different outfits, different passports out. I mean, I was like, wow, this is really incredible to see, so many different people. I said, I would love to make a YouTube video just interviewing all these people and saying, what's your impressions of China? What are you doing here? And kind of hear their stories. I think that would be fascinating. But I mean, again, this is what's happening, right? You come here on the ground in China, you see, tens of thousands of Africans here in Guangzhou, coming here. This has been a very big hub for African people for decades. You go back to Africa, you see Chinese people there. So it's very simple. I think once you remove yourself from this Western media bubble, you actually start going to places like China, start talking to African people, start really seeing what's happening. You get a different perspective of the world. And so I think China's in the driver's seat, in my opinion, for, the future of Africa.
It's interesting what you said about the extent to which values should be imposed on others, because there's two ways of looking at it. As the West, we always say, when we put conditionality on trade, and then it's promoting good governance, which is a sign of virtue. And the criticism then of China is that they don't do this; they'll just do business with anyone. And
Right.
but again, it's worth discussing to what extent that is actually a disadvantage, because doing business with everyone, it does. It does appear to be a better model in many ways, and also the universalism of it, because if I have the assumption that your values, your ideas should be imposed on others, this universalism is very much front and center, not just in the United States, but I guess the political West. That is, these are our values at this point in time, they should also be yours. China has very openly talked about it is preserving the distinctiveness of civilizations. Especially Xi Jinping at least has spoken a lot about this.
Yeah.
I would just yeah, I was wondering though, to what extent Africa is included in wider economic connectivity. For example, is there any cooperation on for financial issues? Well, the banks, do they have currency swaps? And also, I know this is something, yeah, which has occupied you, the re replacement of the American-led GPS with the Chinese Baidu system. Is this something that um, the in the tech sector, is this something that being developed in Africa as well?
Yeah, this is a very big story that is actually quite fascinating. So, during this 12-day war between Israel and Iran, there was a point where all of a sudden you started looking at, how was Israel getting this information, for targeting these Iranian officials, and they actually were using GPS on their phones. They were tracking their Instagram, their WhatsApp messages, and there's a big vulnerability there that if you are using these American-controlled networks, that unfortunately, you literally have a target on your back. I mean, the United States, and actually not many people know this, but GPS, the system that is very much around the world, is actually controlled by the U.S. military. So it's actually it's obviously a great technology. It's great to have. I use it every day. Myself, I mean, I'm very happy to have this navigation system. But what happens is we start looking in the future and where we're going. And I think there's a lot of people that necessarily would not want to be tracked by the U.S. government. And this is where, for example, Iran said, you know what, we're shutting this down. China has an alternate system. What a very interesting thing happened is that, this actually goes back to 1993. There was actually a cargo ship from China, a Chinese cargo ship that the U.S. government thought was transporting chemical weapons to Iran. They shut down the GPS. They stalled this cargo ship in the Indian Ocean for 24 days, and of course they inspected it and they found nothing wrong. There was no chemical weapons, but China was very frustrated. They said, how can you just have the authority to shut down our ship and demand that you search it? We were doing nothing wrong. It was just a cargo ship. But the U.S. said that's our prerogative. We're the world police. We can do whatever we want. And so this was again 1993, and it was at that moment China said we need to build our own. We don't want to be relying on this because it's a vulnerability. And it's kind of a common thing that we see between US and China. For example, the space station, right? United States and many nations around the world work together. The International Space Station is a collaborative effort. Well, they said, China said, we'd like to send our astronauts there. America said, you're not allowed. We can't have you come to our space station. So China said, okay, fine. We build our own then. So they built their own. And, very soon the International Space Station will be decommissioned. China will have the only space station there because, again, there's opportunities to collaborate. But if the U.S. is going to restrict the Chinese, then they will do that themselves. We've seen that with microchips. You're not allowed to buy our advanced microchips. No problem. We'll build our own. Hey, you're not allowed to have the Android system in your phone. Hey, you're not allowed to use Android in the Huawei phone. No problem. We'll build Harmony. It's our own operating system. So, this is a continuous theme that we see in many, many different things. As far as the financial thing, I think what's very interesting is we are seeing these currency swap agreements where renminbi is being used a lot more in international trade. For example, if we are, South Africa and, we have the rand, and then you've got the, Chinese renminbi, we're doing trade. Why not conduct trade in our local currencies? Why not, bypass the US dollar if we don't have to use that? I think that's becoming a more common thing around the world. We had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, come out and say, this is terrible. Like Brazil, they're doing more trade with China. Like our tariffs and our sanctions will be completely useless in just a few years because they're going to be bypassing the U.S. dollar. And so again, this is a result of when your government is constantly putting these tariffs and sanctions, and you look at how many tariffs and sanctions, people are getting tired of this. People just do not want to deal with this. And so I think the Beidou satellite system, which is China's GPS equivalent, is now operating in almost 70% of the world now has turned on that system and has this alternative. And, here in the streets of China, I use Baidu, for example, Baidu Maps. The technology is fantastic. I mean, it's much more advanced than like a Google Maps. I mean, accuracy down to the really down to like your centimeter. I mean, it's amazing how accurate, these, things are, and how amazing the maps are. And even when you're using the navigation system and they have all the 3D buildings in there, I mean, it's really, really detailed in how they've done that. So, again, I think it's what kind of world do we want to live in? And I think it's a world where there's a lot more cooperation, and I think China right now is winning in a lot of ways. They think they just had we had the BRICS summit in Brazil a couple of weeks ago. New countries like Vietnam have joined. Indonesia is now a full member. I mean, there's a lot of different movement going around, and again, a tremendous amount of interest from Africa. And I think the big thing, and kind of the moral of today's video and our interview today is you can just see is there's a hungry desire. Glenn, I mean, you and I are both YouTubers. Every time I put out a video giving an update of this, I'm amazed at how many comments I get from African people. Hello, Cyrus, I'm from Mozambique. I'm a big fan of BRICS. I love what China's doing. We want our country to be there. Hello, I'm from Nigeria. Hello, I'm, from South Africa, from, Algeria, from all over. People are genuinely really wanting to see this, and it's quite incredible to, to once again, you remove yourself from the media bubble and, actually start talking to African people. They get a very different perception of what's happening in our world right now.
Well, in geoeconomics, you pretty much learn that if you have excessive economic dependence on a more powerful state, this is usually converted into political influence. And this is why you often do see this, though, that if you're too dependent on the technology on a foreign nation, they will use this well against you, as you said with the Chinese ship. If you're too much dependent on a currency, then they will also have this extraterritorial jurisdiction. If you're too dependent on the banks, even payment systems, I see that China's also the SIP system, which is the alternative to SWIFT, is also now spreading quite nicely, because simply as an alternative, because if there is only one venue you can go, then that's you give that actor a lot of political power. So I think this would be positive for Africa altogether, the ability to actually diversify, to avoid all this concentration of power in one economic partner, which well, then makes a political sovereignty very difficult to achieve.
Absolutely.
Just as a final question, though, is there what is you mentioned that people like Marco Rubio has expressed concern that our future sanctions won't work if countries have alternatives, but as China's making all these inroads into Africa, I mean, the United States have a big budget for in informing people how bad China is in the media, which is, we used to call that political propaganda, but fair enough. But how else is America attempting to counter this? Because China seems to be, it's not stagnant. It's the cooperation team seems to be expanding. So more nations encompassing more and more economic activities. How is the United States going to respond to this? Are they doing a complementary development program? Are they seeking to sabotage the Chinese? What can be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, it was interesting, Glenn, a few years ago, you heard the United States wanted to come up with their own Belt and Road Initiative. They wanted to call it the Build Back Better, the triple B, the Build Back Better. We're going to, we're going to build it. We're going to start investing all of this. And, it's kind of a very interesting thing that happens in the U.S. where, and I really relate this to how our politics work, because when you're running for president, you need to say things to get a vote, right? Actually, you can say whatever you want because you're never held accountable for actually achieving it. So it's like, hey, we're going to build this amazing wall on the border of Mexico. It's going to be tremendous, and guess what? We're going to have Mexico pay us to build the wall. So a lot of voters are like, great, sounds great. Of course, that's never going to happen. But you can that's the problem, right? You can just say whatever you want. So all of a sudden, the United States says, okay, we're going to, you know what? China has the Belt and Road. We've got to build back better. And of course, like America is, we're going to do it better. We're going to do it bigger. We're going to do it better. It's going to be amazing. We're going to invest billions of dollars. We're going to do all this great stuff. And then all of a sudden, 18 months pass and you don't hear anything of it again. Right? You do a Google search. You can't find any article on it. You ask, people asking the media, Anything up on this, anything updates on the Build Back Better? It's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. So again, you almost have this announcement to try to, gain some credibility. But at the end of the day, again, if you're not on the ground and you're not actually building the tangible things, how are you going to influence the people? And this is where that study comes in, is very important when you say, look, we've conducted all of these surveys throughout all of Africa, right? This is not one survey. This is hundreds and hundreds of surveys throughout all the countries in Africa, and really talking to different people of backgrounds and villages and everywhere you go. And we've concluded in this report that China is genuinely very popular. And of course, like I gave that illustration earlier, if these younger kids, why do so many of them have a positive, thought of China? Well, again, when I was born, I had this road that was built, and I get to go to school. And guess what? The road, the airport, the school, the port, everything's been built by China. You're going to have that nice, positive affiliation, with China. So I think, as far as the U.S., I think, unfortunately, the only thing they're going to do is continue to lecture, and say, look, we're the global superpower. You should work with us. But, Glenn, you and I both know that the world has changed. It is not the unipolar world that once existed where, yes, there was a time in history where the U.S. was the only superpower. They were relatively unchanged and they had a tremendous amount of leverage. But those days are beyond us. And it is a world right now where it is multipolar. And I think the world has two options. You can either work with the United States or work with China. But I think most countries are trying to work with both. Again, I mean, I'm a U.S. citizen. I would love countries, my companies and my country to do business in Africa. But I know that China will be there as well. And I think that's I really want to point the difference in the U.S. approach. The U.S. is, it's amazing. You actually listen to the African leaders after they come to Washington, D.C., and they attend this U.S. Africa summit. And many of them are very vocal. I come here and I get lectured. I come here, and not only that, it's also how I'm spoken to. Joe Biden in the last summit, he said, well, this is what we're going to do for the continent of Africa. African people need this. And the African leaders are like, hey, we're 54 nations. We have 54 individual needs. Well, you can't just lump us all together. Yes, we're all African, but the continent is very unique and diverse. Just look at the landscapes and how, not every country is the same. So we're all going to need different things. And that's where China would actually have a very different approach. They would say, let's have 54 individual meetings. Why? Because we need to meet with everybody individually and figure out what everybody needs. So just that difference alone is going to be the difference between success and failure over the long term. And again, honestly, it's just business 101. That's just about cultivating relationships and, honestly, just taking time to listen to the counterpart. And I think that's unfortunately not the United States' strength, because the United States, our way is the best way. We are the best. We have this American exceptionalism that unfortunately is bred into us from a very young age. But as you can tell, I mean, I've spent a lot of time abroad. It's not like I don't like the United States. It's my home country. I'll always love the United States, and I'll always be proud to be U.S. But I'm proud to also be a well-traveled American citizen that understands how this world works and understands that we need to build relationships, and that's the key to having better economic success in the future.
Yeah, I hope more people pay attention to Africa, because the population growth, also the economic growth. People often ignore that many of the fastest growing economies now are Africans as well. They are doing quite well. There's a lot of opportunities. So it's a bit the fact that China will have a key role in this. It's quite an important historical development. So
It really is.
anyways, Cyrus, thank you so much, my friend, for taking the time. I hope to be able to convince you to come back on again some other time.
Anytime, Glenn. Always time for you, my friend. Thank you for everything you do, and congrats on the success of your channel. Always love to see it continue to grow and reach more people.
Thank you.
All right. Take